Hey, everybody. Welcome. Glad to be here with all of you. I've been traveling and now I am back here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment, ready to talk to you about some very serious recent events. So, a lot to talk about tonight. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Let's have another show.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just is a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. So glad to be here with all of you. Yeah, I'm back. But there was just a horrific terrorist attack in Russia. And it's more than just a terrorist attack. And we're going to talk about that as the evening progresses. But I'm really glad to be back here with all of you. It was a really life-changing trip in Russia, and I got plenty to say about it. You saw a lot of it probably here on this YouTube channel. But anyway, folks, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the way I do these live streams, I give opening remarks, which is what I'm doing right now. I talk about, whatever's on my mind. I give the opening remarks. While I'm giving the opening remarks, I am making note of Super Chat questions. Here on YouTube, they're on Super Chat. On Rumble, they are Rumble Rants. On Rockfin, they are Rockfin Tips. And as I am live, I am making note of people's questions that come in. Then, when I'm done with my opening remarks, then from there, we do a roll call. We find out who it is who's on the other side of the camera, who's watching. We do names and locations, and that's always really fun because we find out who's watching, who's on the other side of the camera. That's really great. And then after that, I answer questions for the second half of the show. So if there's something you would like me to talk about in the second half of our program, the best thing to do is send me a Super Chat, send me a Rumble Rant, send me a Rockfin Tip, and I will answer your question in the second half of the show. I'll do my best to give you an answer to the question. Every rarely there is something I can't answer or I can't respond to. But for the most part, if you ask me a question, I will give you an answer. That's generally the way it works. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Quick announcement, right? We always have announcements here. The Center for Political Innovation, which is the organization that I am part of. We've got 150 members across the United States right now, 150 dues-paying members. We are having a national educational workshop coming up. And this will be at the end of April 26th through the 29th in Vermont. And it's going to be awesome. It is going to be absolutely awesome. So I need you to be there. I need you to sign up to attend. Here is the link. I dropped it in the chat here. I'll drop it in the Rockfin. I'll drop it in the Rumble. But I need you to sign up and attend. We've got a decent number of people coming already, but still plenty of space. And the whole point of these live streams is to bring you into an in real life community of anti-imperialists, an in real life community of solidarity. This is not simply a social media brand. We are building a real movement for anti-imperialism. So we would love to have you become a member of the Center for Political Innovation. And if you just want to check us out, if you're not a member, register and come to our national gathering. Get to know us as a community of anti-imperialists, a community of solidarity. We'd love to get to know you better. So go ahead and register and sign up for our national weekend retreat that is coming up. CPI is absolutely rising, says Windy City Socialist. Alex Rickel says 150 members and only continuing to grow. Damn right. We are marching ahead as an organization. So come join us for our national workshop in Vermont. You have the link. We would love to have you there. Everyone who comes is going to get a copy of our new textbook. There's going to be a lot of fun activities, a lot of good food, a lot of singing, a lot of getting to know you activities, and it'll be a great place to make some friends who share our anti-imperialist perspective. So I just want to throw that out there, what CPI is up to. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Jumping into my opening remarks now. I'll be making a note of any Rumble rants, Rockfin tips, or super chats. Please send those because we need something to talk about in the second half of the show. You all make the second half of the show happen. So I'm just going to start with my opening remarks, folks. Now, obviously, my opening remarks are themed around that horrendous terrorist attack that just happened in Russia. Yesterday evening, there was a concert that was happening on the outskirts of Moscow, a youth concert, and terrorists went into the concert and began shooting people, and they set off a grenade that caught the building on fire. The death count continues to rise. Well over 100 people have died. The last I heard, it was something like 150 people, but I will check. 133 is the number I'm seeing right now. But I mean, this is an utterly horrendous terrorist attack. Russia is at this point in a state of mourning. They've closed down all public gatherings. This is shocking. The Russian president was on national television talking about it. They have already arrested some of the perpetrators, and we're going to talk about, there's a lot to talk about here, but this is utterly horrific. Utterly horrific to attack a concert, a young people's concert, to open fire into a crowd of civilians and just murder people. People in Russia are asking that people use on Twitter hashtag pray for Russia, hashtag stop terrorism. That's what our friends in Russia are asking people to tweet around. Hashtag stop terrorism, hashtag pray for Russia. Now, I've got a lot to say about this, and I'm going to have to try and say all of this without getting too emotional and getting too worked up about it. I try to be positive. I try to be optimistic. But there's no way around the ugly seriousness about what I'm about to say. Because if you've been following this, if you've been following at least Russian media, and American media has had to acknowledge this, though they've twisted it and they're trying to not point to the facts. But these are the facts. The American government knew this was going to happen. The American government knew this was going to happen. Let me repeat this. The American government knew that this was going to happen. They may not have known specifically when or specifically where, but they knew that something like this was going to happen. They knew. And how do we know that they knew? Because they told us. When I was in Russia on March 7th, I was made aware that the U.S. State Department had put out a travel advisory for Russia aimed at U.S. citizens in Russia, urging us not to go to concerts. And saying that, quote, extremists were planning possible attacks on concerts. On March 7th, the American government announced that they knew something might happen. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's not something we made up. They had the date a little early, but the American government knew. Now, how did they know? How did the American government know? What information did the American government have? Now, this is where the facts of the case get a little bit murky. But what we know is the American government had prior knowledge of this attack. Now, there's no way around that. What we also know is that the U.S. government is arming Ukraine and has spent billions and billions of dollars to arm Ukraine. And that Ukraine has already lost the war. Right? Just before the attack took place at the United Nations Security Council, they had a UN Security Council meeting. And the Russian ambassador Nebenzia said, at this point, the war is over. The war's over. The Ukrainians have been completely disarmed at this point. The only thing that keeps the war going is the foreign weapons. The foreign weapons that keep pouring into the country. Ukraine has already lost the war. And at this point, Ukrainians are fleeing the country to not have to fight in the war because the war is over. And they are dragging old men off the street, dragging people off the street and forcing them to fight. People are fleeing the country. It's over. Ukraine has lost the war. Russia has solidified control over Donetsk, over Lugansk, over Kherson. At this point, the new republics are secure. The war is over. Ukraine has lost. However, what we know is that it's not just the Ukrainian military that the United States has been training in Ukraine. It has also been radical anti-Russian extremists, Banderites, individuals who admire Stepan Bandera, who was a Nazi collaborator who rounded up Jews to go to the gas chambers. He rounded up Ukrainian Jews and put them in gas, handed over them to the Nazis so that they could put them in gas chambers, right? And that there's a big faction in Ukraine of Ukrainian extremists who admire and consider themselves to be disciples and followers of a Nazi collaborator, of a Holocaust participant, and that these folks are not part of the regular Ukrainian military, though some of them are, but they are these extremist organizations. And that on the battlefield, they look like they're on drugs. They are given stimulants that drug them up so they don't feel any pain. And they tend to have swastika tattoos and Nazi tattoos all up and down them. And they are vicious murderers. We talk about the Azov Battalion and these other groups. So that's one factor to keep in mind. The other factor to keep in mind is that for the past couple years, as this conflict has been going on, there have been Russians recruited on the internet by the intelligence agencies to engage in terrorism and assassinations. That the intelligence agencies, the Western intelligence agencies, they have ways of profiling people and manipulating their behavior, finding the right kind of person and becoming their best friend on social media and manipulating them. And that's how the murder of Daria Dugina was carried out. That's how the murder of another Russian journalist, his name is escaping me at the moment, was carried out. And it appears that is how this terrorist attack was carried out. Now, I'm going to show you, this is the video that has surfaced of the one of the perpetrators describing how he was recruited to do this act. This is the video that the Russian security services have released of one of the murderers, one of the terrorist murderers who helped carry out this horrendous attack.
When did you arrive from Turkey? What did you do in Turkey? My documents expired, so I crossed the border. Once again, your full name. Year of birth, 1998. What did you do in Crocus yesterday? What did you do in Crocus? I was shooting. You were shooting? You were shooting who? Why? For money. Money? Let's put him up. For how much money? Some 500,000. 500,000 of what? Of rubles. Did you get it from who? I have received only one half. It was transferred to my card. Where's your card? He gave it, and it was in my clothes, in my jacket, so I lost it. Where did you get weapons? They gave it to us. Who they? I don't know who they. They texted me on Telegram without names, without anything. How did they find you? You found them or they found you? They texted me. Why did they text you in particular? I don't know. I was listening to... But how come they just offer you to kill people out of thin air? It doesn't happen like this. What was on Telegram? I was listening to a prophet, to a sermon. You were listening to sermons, and who texted you? Assistant of a preacher. What's his name? No name, no last name, no nothing. They just texted me. When did they text you? A month ago. Who texted you? Exactly. He texted me, he promised me 1 million rubles. What did he promise you? What did he want from you? He offered me and I agreed. What did he offer? He offered money. For what? Money for what? He offered me to do these deeds for money. What deeds exactly? To kill people. To kill who? He just sent me the location. Did they tell you who to kill? People. What people? Doesn't matter. Anyone you meet there, anyone you encounter, just enter the location and kill people? Yes. Once again, your full name and your year of birth. Born in 1998. September 17th.
So, what that guy is describing, he said he was listening to an Islamic preacher on Telegram. He was listening to some kind of Muslim preacher. And then somebody claiming to be an assistant of one of these preachers reached out to him and contacted him and started giving him money to do things and eventually recruited him to carry out this terrorist attack. Now, we understand that ISIS-K has taken responsibility for the attack, but that guy doesn't sound like an ISIS-K fighter. Furthermore, it appears that the suspects who carried out this horrendous terrorist attack, they were fleeing to Ukraine. They were running to the Ukrainian border, and there were Ukrainian military people ready to pick them up at the border. That's what Russia has confirmed. So Ukraine was involved in this attack, according to Russia at this point. It looks like these individuals had people waiting for them at the Ukrainian border, Ukrainian government people ready to pick them up. And it appears that they were profiled for the fact that they were religious. They were profiled and a relationship was developed, and that over time they were manipulated. And this is all very, very, very important because of an article that was run in the Washington Post. This article did not get enough attention. It caught my eye for sure. But this is an article that ran in the Washington Post a few weeks back. And if you look at this article, it's all about how on the app known as Discord, there is networks of people that learn to manipulate people's behavior. On Discord, there are, it tells the story. There was a teenage girl, and this teenage girl, she's made friends with a guy on Discord. And this guy on Discord asked her for a naked picture. She sent it to him. And then he threatened to send this picture to her friends and to her high school classmates if she didn't do what he said. It's very disturbing. You read the details of this article. It's a very, very disturbing article. Now, this article just makes it sound like it's bad actors. It's just individuals. It's just bad actors. It's just, people that mean bad things. However, the more you look into this is clearly some kind of intelligence activity. Because if you look at the way these terrorists have been recruited, that guy was recruited in a similar manner. He made an online friend who started giving him money to do things. Furthermore, if you look at some of these organizations that have been involved in this, they make it sound like these are just bad actors. But people should check out the Order of Nine Angles. All right, this is a satanic cult in the United Kingdom, the Order of Nine Angles. And it was this organization that was training people, recruiting people to do this kind of activity. They had kind of perfected the art. This is a satanic organization based in the United Kingdom that had perfected the art of recruiting people online and manipulating their behavior and getting them to do things. And the Order of Nine Angles, the more you look into this, you see that this is not just a bunch of weirdos on the internet. There's some well-connected people that are tied in to the Order of Nine Angles, the more you look into it. And it's very clear that the intelligence apparatus has kind of learned the art of finding people on the internet. They profile certain people who are the kind of people that maybe have difficulty engaging with people in real life, but are much more comfortable with an online friend. And they learn over time how to manipulate the person's behavior. They have certain profiles that they look for, and how to manipulate their behavior. And this is what intelligence agencies are doing. And I've got to tell you, this is of particular interest to me because some of the attacks against the Center for Political Innovation, obviously it's not anything like these horrendous terrorist attack. These are just, stupid, childish things that have happened. Some of those things have been carried out in the same way. I have directly observed people who suddenly make online friends. They suddenly make online friends, and these online friends are just their best pals. And these online friends are gradually inciting them to get angry at CPI and to turn away from CPI. And I've seen this, right? And what I'm telling you is that this is a pattern, right? And we've also seen that there are a number of communities that sound kind of like we sound. They sound kind of like the Center for Political Innovation, but they have no in real life events. They have no meetups. They have nothing. They're purely online communities where you have no idea who anybody else is, where it's all done over Discord servers, and it's all done. And this is all open season on manipulation. It's all open season on manipulation. And I see the 2 super chats that have come in. I look forward to answering them. I see there's a Rumble rant that's come in as well. This is all open season on manipulation. And it's something to be aware of. Right? And that they're admitting that this goes on. This is a widespread trend. And it's widely acknowledged that organized crime engages in this kind of behavior too. People will make an online friend who's actually a drug dealer, who becomes their best friend, gives them some money, and then asks them to launder money for them or deliver drug packages. This is a new part of the new frontier of the internet. And to think that intelligence agencies are not involved in this, and to think that these are just bad actors, is complete naivete. Look, this terrorist attack that happened, the fact that the American government basically announced it was going to happen beforehand. The American government announced this because they wanted Russia to perceive this as coming for the American government. That's what comes across here. The American government wanted to attack Russia, but they wanted to have deniability. But they wanted to very clearly send a message to Russia that when this went down, that they were the ones who did it. They wanted to send that message, right? And they did it very much. This is gangster behavior. I am so tired of gangster aesthetics, right? Because, they always try to tell us Putin is a gangster. Putin is not a gangster. Putin's a responsible statesman trying to keep his country together and trying to keep his country safe. And he rescued his country from the fall of the Soviet Union. He reoriented the economy to be centered around state-controlled oil and gas. And he stabilized and he restored the industrial base, and he defeated the Chechen separatists, and he stabilized Chechnya, and he rebuilt the farming sector, and he's made life a lot better in Russia. And he's a family man. He's all about family values. He's all about good services for children. Putin's not a gangster. Our Western leaders are gangsters because what they did to Russia was gangster-like behavior, right? This is basically the equivalent of, we all know about protection rackets. The gangster comes to your house and he says, there's a lot of people in this neighborhood who like to break windows. But if you give me some money, I can make those people not break your windows. So give me some money, right? Because I'd sure hate these windows to be broken. There's bad guys out there that might break these windows. So do what I say, give me some money, and then I'll make sure the bad guys don't break your windows. That's called a protection racket. It's one of the most common gangster activities, one of the most common things that organized crime does, right? I'd sure hate for somebody to steal, some of that jewelry you've got in your house. But if you give me some money, I can make sure that doesn't happen, right? This is organized. This is the protection racket. And this is what the American government did. They said, we got some bad news. It looks like somebody might attack a concert in Russia. We'd hate to see that happen. Maybe Russia should just do what we want because we'd really hate this to happen. I mean, we got some information that maybe somebody might be planning to attack a concert, and geez, we would not want that to happen. Oh boy, we don't want that to happen. That's exactly what they did here, right? I mean, it's bingo. That's what they did. They wanted Russia to understand that this came from them, but they wanted to have international deniability. That's what happened here. And just it's that simple. Right? And this is gangster behavior. This is organized crime behavior at this point, right? They have given up winning over the Russian people. They have given up trying to take the high road internationally. They've given up on Ukraine. Ukraine has already lost the war. So at this point, the American government is just acting like a gangster. It's just acting like a gangster. And Victoria Nuland recently resigned. Right? Victoria Nuland, she said, and that there would be surprises ahead for Russia. Again, another hint. It's right in front of your face, and that's where these things are starting to go. And I've noticed this, and it's very interesting because it's for people who believe the mainstream. What I'm seeing in mainstream media is ridiculous, right? They're saying, well, America warned Russia. What do you mean America warned Russia? If they were warning Russia, they would have told them who the terrorists were and enabled them to arrest them and stop it. They didn't warn Russia. They gave Russia a vague warning 2 weeks, a week and a half ahead of time on March 7th. That's not warning Russia. And they haven't proceeded to tell Russia where they got their information. Right? If the U.S. government was really concerned about stopping terrorism, as soon as they found out this was being planned, they would have immediately gone to the Russian government and said, these individuals, we captured a message from these individuals. And these individuals, they're planning to do this, and they would have arrested them. And you know what? That's exactly what Russia did before the Boston bombing. Did you know this? Before the Boston Marathon bombing, Russia was watching the Tsarnaev brothers. And they went to the U.S. government and they said, these Tsarnaev brothers, these two individuals, they named the people. They didn't just say vaguely, there might be some athletic event. No, they said these two individuals, the Tsarnaev brothers, we've been watching them and we think that they are planning an attack and you should stop it. And the American government didn't stop it. Russia tried to save American lives in Boston and the American government failed. Whereas here, the American government did not try to save any lives. And it looks like the American government at least knew this was going to happen. It looks like the Ukrainian government, which is basically just a front for the NATO governments, including the American government. It looks like the Ukrainian government was involved in this. They recruited some religious fanatics, some individuals that were involved in fanatical Islamic online communities who they profiled. I'm sure they profiled these guys ahead of time, right? They profiled them. They found the perfect guys who were not going to think this through, who would be easy to manipulate. They had somebody get to be their friend on the internet, get to be their buddy on the internet, get to be their friend, give them a little bit of money, get them to do some things that are a little bit risky and nothing happened so they could see that it was safe or whatever, and get them to the point that they trusted them. And then they got those guys to go and do this. And they even had people waiting for them at the Ukrainian border. If they had made it, they would have gotten the protection of Ukraine. And that's what happened here. And there's a whole history of all of this, right? And there's a lot of history we can get into. And thank you, Gala. Everyone should be praying for Russia right now. I was just over there, and I'm in utter shock that this is happening, right? I remember March 7th when the warning went out. I was in Moscow at the time, and the warning went out, and people were perplexed by it, and then nothing happened. But it's shocking, but there's a lot here. Okay, when we talk about extremist groups and how they're used by intelligence agencies, there's a lot here, right? And I talk about this in Where is America Going? And in fact, if you really want some information, if you really want to kind of understand how this happened, if you want to understand these kinds of events, you really should read chapter 3 of Where is America Going? You can listen to the audiobook. Tyler McConnell did a great audiobook of it. So if you're more of an audio person, I always get more out of audiobooks than written books. But chapter 3 of Where is America Going is called Gangs, Counter Gangs, and Revolutionaries. And in that chapter, I talk about all of this because there's, when we talk about terrorism, when we talk about non-state actors, when we talk about fourth generation warfare, when we talk about Islamic extremists and Wahhabi extremists, when we talk about terrorist methods and assassination, all of this is very, very important to understand. So I'm going to quickly summarize, since it's very, very relevant to what just happened. I'm going to quickly summarize what I talk about in the book in chapter 3. So we all know that a long time ago in Europe, there was a guy named Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was an advocate of communism and socialism. And Karl Marx, he was all about building labor unions and political parties that would support the labor unions. And after, during Marx's life, he built the First International, and he was fighting with anarchists, and it fell apart. And around the time that Marx was dying, we had emerging the Second International. And the Second International was the big grouping of socialist parties, very big all over Europe. The British Labour Party, which still exists today, was part of the Second International. The German Social Democratic Party was the biggest party of the Second International. And all the socialist groups of Europe, they existed, and they were called the Second International. They were labor parties, social democratic parties, socialist parties, and they were everywhere in Europe. And they had millions of members, and they had seats in parliament, but they didn't make a revolution. Revolution wasn't happening. And around the time of 1900, the turn of the century, you had what was called the crisis of Marxism. Because Marxists and people that built labor parties and socialist parties, people that organized trade unions, they were everywhere. But there was no revolution. And the revolution wasn't happening. Marxism and socialism was everywhere, but there was no revolution. So there started to be what they called the crisis of Marxism, with people trying to explain why was Marxism not creating the revolution. So among the Marxists, you got a variety of different answers. The one answer that was very prevalent and popular was that they said there will be no revolution. Edward Bernstein and the people that they called the revisionists said that the idea that you were going to have some kind of revolution, that was a little bit dogmatic. And they said that capitalism in the Western countries was just kind of naturally turning into socialism. They had established universal male suffrage. Every man got to vote, and there were more working class men than capitalist men. So eventually the workers could outvote the capitalists. They had created public education in Germany, and capitalism was just kind of naturally turning into socialism. That was one response to the crisis of Marxism. Now, we also know the other response, the response that, people here probably agree with the most, which was Lenin's response, which, as he said, well, this is because capitalism has entered a new stage called imperialism. And in the stage of imperialism, the revolutionary energy is not in the Western countries, it's in the oppressed and colonized countries. And that in the imperialist homelands, capitalism is stabilized, and a big layer of the working class have been bought off, right? And that they are, the imperialists, the Western capitalists are dominating the whole world, and they're making super profits. And with those super profits, they can afford to buy off a layer of people at home, well-paid workers or labor aristocrats. And that those labor aristocrats, because they've been bought off, because they get better wages and better conditions, they're less revolutionary. And that is dividing the working class. And that's what Lenin understood. And so based on that, Lenin said the revolutionary energy would be in the colonized world, it'd be in oppressed countries rather than in the West. And that whole countries in the oppressed world would struggle for national liberation. That's the Leninist understanding. But in addition to the revisionists and in addition to Lenin, in response to the crisis of Marxism, you also had, I think I've got his book over here, if I'm not, you had this guy. Yeah, well, this is a book about him. You had George Sorel. This is a biography of George Sorel, right? The political and social theories of George Sorel, right? And I've got a picture of George Sorel. George Sorel. And George Sorel, right, this guy, he was a French intellectual, and he was another individual who arose in response to the crisis of Marxism. And George Sorel argued that the failure of Marxism in Europe, he wasn't aware of Lenin's theories. He and Lenin never interacted. At the time of his death, he was an admirer of Lenin. He was also an admirer of Mussolini, but he never met Lenin. Lenin never read any of his works. There's no knowledge of the two of them ever knowing of each other. But he said that the failure of Marxism in Europe was a spiritual one rather than a political one. And he said that the mistake that Karl Marx and the Marxist movement made was they built huge organizations, and that was a mistake. And he said instead, they should be building groups of fanatics. And he basically, Sorel argued that Western capitalist societies at that time were divided into three. You had the servile masses, the sheep, ordinary people who were just trying to survive. And you had the decadent rich, the bourgeoisie, who were, decadent and hedonistic. And he said that there was a third layer of people, and those were the men of violence, the warrior caste. And he argued that there were men who were committed to carrying out the cause of righteousness, who believed in justice, and were attracted to the spiritual power of violence. And he argued that the mistake the Marxists made is they were trying to organize the sheeple, the broad masses, and they should instead be organizing the warrior caste. That was their thinking. And so he argued for the creation of a fanatical organization of men who would engage in violence for spiritual purposes. And he offered a spiritual critique. And he very much admired syndicalism. Syndicalism was a wing of the labor movement that rejected all politics. It rejected all politics entirely. And instead, it advocated only direct action on the job. And that was what they put forward. Only direct action on the job, right? And the spiritual power of violence. George Sorel also argued that there was a power in myth. The syndicalists, they used to talk about the great general strike, that one day there would be a great general strike where all the workers of the world would go on strike, and that would be the revolution. And George Sorel, in his writings, he says, well, maybe this great general strike will never happen, but who cares? The myth, the spiritual power of the myth will motivate people to go out and do great things. So it doesn't really matter if it's true or not. And he talks about how in some of the physical labor-oriented jobs, the men haze each other. They have hazing rituals that they engage in where they kind of violently degrade each other, kind of like fraternity hazing, and how that's got spiritual quality. And George Sorel is this weird dude, and he's saying that optimism and looking towards the future is a mistake, that we should be looking to the past, in the past, in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and masculinity and strength. And he takes, socialism in this weird direction where it's all about big brawny men who engage in violence, and that's what he's doing, right? That's George Sorel. Well, George Sorel, he basically oversees a wing of the French syndicalist movement that basically turns against the labor unions, because they say the labor unions aren't revolutionary. They become strike breakers. He builds kind of a fanatical group of men. Now, what's important to note is that Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist, said that he owed, of all the great writers and thinkers in the world, he owed the most to George Sorel. And that Benito Mussolini was a follower of George Sorel. And the Black Shirt Gang, the Fascisti of Italy, were very much inspired by George Sorel's teachings. And that's Mussolini's black shirts were Sorelian syndicalists before they became fascisti. And that Sorelian syndicalism that was anti-communist, and believed in kind of looking backward, had a critique of capitalist society, but was obsessed with masculinity and violence and the spiritual power of violence. That laid the basis for fascism as a political movement. And that's very interesting as well. What's also very interesting is that if you read Adolf Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, in that book, one thing that he makes abundantly clear is that he hates communists, right? And libertarians are always like, well, he was a national socialist. Yes, but he hated communism. He hated Marxism, right? He thought that communism was going to destroy the great German nation or whatever. And in Mein Kampf, one of the points that Adolf Hitler makes is he says that the reason that the German government had never been able to smash communism is because they only fought it with the status quo, right? That communism is building this revolutionary movement, and that the fight against communism had only been based on the status quo. And so Hitler, it can be inferred, is saying that Nazism is an attempt to build a quote-unquote revolutionary movement to defeat communism. That's what he's saying. And if you look at it that way, this explains a lot of things. And the way we know that the Nazis started out as a group of street fighters. They were a group that was going around and fighting communists in the streets. That's important as well. Now, the other thing that's important to note is that there were all kinds of networks of leftists and revolutionary activists in Europe in the lead up to World War I. All kinds of them, right? There were labor unions, there were anarchists who engaged in assassinations and bombings. There were all kinds of networks of radicals throughout Europe. And that these networks of radicals were all heavily infiltrated by intelligence. For example, how did Lenin get back to Russia, right? How was it that Lenin, who was in exile in Switzerland, got to Russia? Well, we know that a German intelligence officer named Alexander Parvus, who worked for the German secret police, Germany was at war with Russia, and Lenin was against World War I, and the Bolsheviks were known as the big party that was against World War I. And the Tsar had been brought down. There'd been an uprising that had toppled the Tsar, and Russia was in chaos. And so in Switzerland, Lenin got a knock on his door from Alexander Parvus. And Alexander Parvus, I'll show you a picture of Alexander Parvus. Alexander Parvus, this German intelligence officer, an arms dealer. He sold arms to the Turks, to the Ottoman Empire. Alexander Parvus knocked on Lenin's door and said, hey, I've got some money and I've got some train tickets. And this guy showed up at Lenin's house and said, want to go back to Russia? And Alexander Parvus arranged for Lenin and the Bolsheviks to go back to Russia because they thought that the Bolsheviks, hey, they're against World War I. Our enemy is the Russians. We'd like Russia to pull out of World War I. So let's send the anti-war guy back to Russia with a bunch of money and see if he can cause some problems. Now, that's not the only reason that the Bolsheviks came to power. The Bolshevik Revolution wasn't a German conspiracy. But we do know the Germans, their intelligence agencies, the German secret police and German secret service had pretty well infiltrated the Bolsheviks, and that they were nudging and using the Bolsheviks to try and get Russia to pull out of World War I. And it's not a secret, and it's not the only reason they took power, but it happened. However, what's also interesting, though, is if you look into Alexander Parvus, this guy Alexander Parvus, who we now know was this German intelligence officer, not only was Alexander Parvus the guy who was responsible for sending Lenin back to Russia, but Alexander Parvus was the personal mentor of Leon Trotsky. This guy was Leon Trotsky's best buddy, Leon Trotsky's personal mentor. And the theory of permanent revolution, which is the basis of Trotskyism, is actually, Trotsky says, was invented by Alexander Parvus. Trotsky, got the idea for the theory of permanent revolution from Alexander Parvus, who was a German intelligence officer. Now, Let's also talk about what was the primary difference between Vladimir Lenin and Trotsky before the Russian Revolution. Right? What was their primary disagreement? It was over the question of the United States of Europe. Trotsky was going around to communists and revolutionaries and trying to organize them to call for a European Union. Trotsky was trying to create the European Union because he said that would break down barriers and it would bring the workers of Europe together. He wanted to create a United States of Europe, or a European Union. And Trotsky was very dedicated to this. And Lenin was against the creation of a United States of Europe because he said that would strengthen imperialism. If you got Germany and Britain and France and Belgium and all these countries together, they could more effectively exploit the third world. But Trotsky said, no, according to his theory of permanent revolution, the West is what matters. The West is the best. So if you can bring all the Western countries together and break down national barriers, and that is the primary disagreement between Trotsky and Lenin. If you read Lenin's very important essay, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, that is what their disagreement was. Well, isn't it interesting that Trotsky's going around Europe advocating the creation of a European Union? And it also happens to be that his mentor and his best bud is a guy who's a German intelligence officer. Now, if you're trying to create a United States of Europe or a European Union, that's something that would benefit German imperialism, right? The Germans are at the center of the European mainland, right? And it's not surprising that the Germans would want to create some kind of European Union, right? Especially since the British are constantly trying to weaken the Germans, right? The British and the Germans don't like each other. The British want control over the European mainland. The Germans are always pushing back against them. This is kind of the history of geopolitics. You have the British that are up there on the British Isles, right? And they want control of the European mainland, and the Germans are always pushing back, right? And when Hitler conquered the European mainland, he called it Fortress Europe. And the Germans have always wanted control of the European mainland, and the British have always wanted influence on the European mainland for themselves. And that's why the greatest fear that the British Empire has always had is Germany and Russia together. Because if Germany and Russia are together, then Britain loses any power on the European mainland. That's why the Germans have been desperate to prevent Germany and Russia from ever aligning, right? And the British have been fanatically dedicated to that effort. The idea of Russia and Germany becoming friends, which would make sense because they're right next to each other, that's something they've worked against. And so put that in your pipe and smoke it. Think about that when you think about the Nord Stream pipeline, right? This was a natural gas pipeline connecting Russia to Germany. And it got blown up. And I think we all know who blew it up. And why was it that there was such a fear of that pipeline? Well, number one, it was about the fact that the Germans would be buying their natural gas from Russia and not from ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron and American natural gas manufacturers. But it was also about the fact that the Germans would get closer to their natural ally, the Russians. And British geopolitical intrigue for the last 1,000 years has been dedicated to separating the Germans and the Russians, right? And there's a whole lot there. Separating the Germans from the Russians has been a very strong objective of British foreign policy. But anyhow, the fact that Leon Trotsky was getting his instructions from a German intelligence officer, the fact that this same German intelligence officer eventually got Lenin back to Russia to do the Russian Revolution, this shows you that all of the revolutionary groups in Europe at this time were all heavily infiltrated, and there was all kinds of manipulation. And that's important. Now, the other thing that I talk about in the book is I talk about gangs and counter gangs, right? And this is where it all gets very interesting. And this all ties back to what happened in Russia. I know this all sounds like random history, but it all gets back to this. 1950s, Kenya is a British colony. Kenya is colonized by the British. The people in Kenya are exploited, and they have an uprising against the British Empire. And it's the Land and Freedom Army, or the Mau Mau. The Mau Mau uprising. The Land and Freedom Army rises up against the British. And the British are very afraid they're going to lose their colony. And so the British Empire moves in to crush the Land and Freedom Army. And you have a war in Kenya. Frank Kitson is a British military officer. And after the British win the war, he publishes a book called Gangs and Counter-Gangs. And it's all about how they defeated the Mau Mau Land and Freedom Army. And the way that they defeated the Mau Mau Land and Freedom Army was they created what they called counter-gangs. And the counter-gangs were groups of Kenyans who pretended that they were part of the Mau Mau Land and Freedom Army, but they were actually working for the British military. And sometimes they would go and commit atrocities. And those atrocities, they would kill innocent people or rape women or something. And the people in Kenya would see that, and they would think that the Mau Mau Land and Freedom Army did it, and they would not support them. In other cases, they would go and find other Mau Mau fighters and get information and bring it back to the British military. And in some cases, they formed rival revolutionary groups who said that they were against the British Empire too, but that the Mau Mau were about to sign a treaty and sell out and betray the revolution, and they would incite violence against the Mau Mau Land and Freedom Army in the name of being more revolutionary than the Land and Freedom Army. And that the counter gangs, Frank Kitson talks about in his book, Gangs and Counter Gangs, they created a level of suspicion and paranoia among the Mau Mau, where they didn't know who was really a Mau Mau fighter and who was actually working for the British. They were getting mixed messages. It wasn't clear, and the confusion that was created by the counter gangs confused the Kenyan Liberation Army to the point that the British could win. Now, the main factor in defeating the Mau Mau Liberation Army was not the counter gangs. The counter gangs were part of it, but the main thing was they just started rounding up all the men and putting them in concentration camps. And you can read the book Imperial Reckoning, which is a book on how the British Empire, I've got it on the shelf over there, how the British Empire won the war in Kenya. I mean, it was genocidal. They just rounded up all the men and put them in these prison camps, basically. But Frank Kitson's book, Gangs and Counter Gangs, talks about the use of counter gangs in low-intensity warfare. And it talks about this. And then it's also worth noting that Frank Kitson was eventually deployed to Northern Ireland. And in Northern Ireland, Frank Kitson oversaw the British, the British basically defeated the IRA, right? The IRA, they signed the Good Friday Agreement and basically surrendered. How did they do it? Well, the way that they did it is that they stopped having the British Army fight the IRA, and instead they funded Protestant extremists to fight the IRA. The IRA tends to be Roman Catholic. The Protestants tend to be pro-British, pro-Union, as they call it. So rather than having the British military fight the IRA, the British Secret Intelligence Services instead funded and gave weapons and support to Protestant gangs that would attack and fight the IRA. At the same time that the British government was also working with the Vatican and the Pope and others to say, give peace a chance. Let's not have Protestants and Catholics killing each other. And it was a very, very effective thing because no one likes ethnic conflict. No one likes one religious group killing another religious group. So by having the Protestant gangs become the IRA's main battlefield enemy and making it look like it was just two religious groups that just couldn't get along, not making it about the British Empire, not making it about national liberation, making it Protestants versus Catholics, on the one hand, funding the Protestant gangs, so that was who the IRA had to focus on fighting. On the other hand, then funding with the NGOs and the peace marches and the Vatican and and this whole thing about kumbaya, give peace a chance, Protestants and Catholics should get along. That's how they were able to defeat the IRA. Now, another writer that I quote in the book that's worth studying is William S. Lind. William S. Lind is a Pentagon strategist. He's the main author of The Surge in Iraq. And he developed the concept of what he called fourth generation warfare. And if you read his handbook for fourth generation warfare, he describes very similar operations to Frank Kitson. He talks about how in our time, war is not fought by states primarily. It is fought by non-state actors. That's the term he used. He doesn't say counter gangs. He says non-state actors. And this is because of nuclear weapons. After the Second World War, after the advent of nuclear weapons, Soviet Union and the United States couldn't fight each other, because if they fought each other, the human race would end because they both had nukes. China and the United States, they can't fight each other. Why? Because they both have nukes. They can't fight each other. So the primary way that war is fought in the 20th century and into the 21st century is with non-state actors. All right? It's kind of similar to what Frank Kitson talks about when he talks about counter gangs. Non-state actors. And non-state actors can be funded covertly by states. Right? Governments can secretly give them weapons or even publicly give them weapons. But they're not a government themselves. They are a political movement, a religious movement, a cultural movement. They're non-state actors. But non-state actors have their own interest. Even though they might be funded by a government, they still have their own interest. And if you read the Handbook for Fourth Generation Warfare by William S. Lind, it's all about how in Iraq, the U.S. government was occupying Iraq and it was facing off with all kinds of different non-state actors. And some of those non-state actors were supported by Iran, and some of those non-state actors were supported by Saudi Arabia, and some of those non-state actors were tied in the old Ba'athist regime. And there were many different non-state actors, warlord kind of groups, that existed in Iraq. And the main way the USA was able to kind of stabilize Iraq was by manipulating these groups against each other, buying a lot of them off, just approaching them with cash and paying off different groups, and creating an atmosphere of confusion and paranoia among the groups, inciting Sunni Muslims against Shia Muslims, and making it so it wasn't a war between the U.S. occupiers and the Iraqi people. Making it so it was just a clusterfuck. It was confusing. No one knew who was working for anybody else. Some of these groups are working with Iran. Some are working with Saudi Arabia. A number of them are all being paid by the American government. And it got so confusing that Iraq couldn't have a national liberation struggle, right? The Vietnam War, it was very clear. You were with the Vietnamese National Liberation Front or you were with the United States. But in Iraq, the way the United States was able to prevent that kind of situation was by making it a clusterfuck. And that is how the imperialists operate. And that's the secret to how, what's kind of like what they did in Northern Ireland. It's kind of like what the British did in Kenya, is that the way to win a counterinsurgency, the imperialists have figured out, is you make it a confusing clusterfuck. So nobody knows who's working for who, where there's people who sound just like each other that are on opposite sides. It's not the capitalists versus the communists. It's some communists versus some communists, some capitalists versus some capitalists. It's not Christians versus Muslim. It's some of the Christians versus some of the Muslims, and some of the Muslims versus some of the Christians. You make it a clusterfuck. And when you make it a clusterfuck, a genuine, solid block of resistance doesn't emerge. Nobody knows who's working for who, and the powers that be can stabilize the situation and stay on top. And that is the strategy that if you read Pentagon textbooks, you read William S. Lind, you read Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, we'll get to him in a minute, right? This is how they have been fighting for the last few decades, right? Is that they create a clusterfuck, they make it very confusing, and then gradually, because it's confusing, a solid block of opposition to them doesn't emerge, and then they can take over, right? And this was the strategy used by Brzezinski during the Cold War, right? During the Cold War, at the beginning of the Cold War, the early Cold War, it was very straightforward. Capitalism and communism. And the United States was on the capitalism side. And Britain and France were on the capitalism side. And China, the Soviet Union, North Korea, Eastern Europe, they were on the communism side. And it was very straightforward. And the USA was getting its ass kicked. In Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, the Korean people delivered the first major defeat that the United States had ever endured, right? That North and South Korea were divided, and the South Korean government started murdering communists. And so the North Koreans tried to move in and protect them. Again, this is one people, right? So the United States sent its military forces into the Korean Peninsula, and then China got involved. And they moved their forces into the Korean Peninsula, and they drove the United States right back down to the 38th parallel. North Korea captured a U.S. Army general. The only U.S. Army general to have ever been captured was captured by North Korea. And the United States got completely humiliated by Mao and Kim Il-sung. And in Vietnam, similar story, right? The United States, sent more and more soldiers to Vietnam, but the Vietnamese people just kept fighting. And on top of that, while the United States was getting humiliated, while these peasant armies are defeating them, the USA is looking like an evil, murderous regime to the world, right? In North Korea, they bomb every building above 1 story tall. In Vietnam, they're just massive bombing of North Vietnam, massive bombing of Cambodia. The USA is looking like a murderous government. The Vatican, the Catholic Church, condemns bombing of civilian areas and the use of bombing. The USA looks like this murderous government that is always getting its ass kicked by peasants. So after the USA is defeated in Vietnam, the Rockefeller family, which is one of the richest families in the United States, they fund something called the Trilateral Commission. And Zbigniew Brzezinski of the Cold War University at Columbia University and Henry Kissinger are hired by David Rockefeller and the Rockefeller think tanks to reorient U.S. foreign policy strategy. And you'll notice that after the USA was defeated in Vietnam, the strategy of the United States in the Cold War completely changed. And it changed, and one of the main ways that they changed it was by making it a clusterfuck. Right? They knew that China and the Soviet Union were not getting along. So Henry Kissinger worked very, very hard to recruit China to be on the side of the United States. And China had been cut off by the Soviet Union, and they needed economic development very badly. It was still such a poor country in the 1970s. And so Nixon went to China, and eventually China came over to the side of the United States. And in the 70s and 80s, China was on the U.S. side in the Cold War. In Angola, the U.S. government was sending fighters in Angola to fight against the MPLA. China was also sending their fighters there. In Afghanistan, when the Soviet Union was fighting against Islamic extremists in Afghanistan, those Islamic extremists were getting trained on Chinese soil over the border from Afghanistan with China, and that China was on the U.S. side. Also, during the Cold War, and, in the Middle East, you had the rise of a number of anti-imperialist movements. And there were 2 very revolutionary anti-imperialist movements that existed in the Middle East at this time. One is called Ba'athist Arab Socialism. Ba'athist Arab Socialism is a secular, non-religious movement that is about creating an Arab nation. And it's an ideology that a lot of military leaders are attracted to. They admire the Soviet Union. And in Iraq and in Syria, you have governments that emerge that are based on Ba'athist Arab socialism. However, you have another revolutionary movement that's emerging at the time, which is Shia Islam, a revolutionary, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist interpretation of Shia Islam. And Ba'athist Arab socialists and Shia Muslims are completely different in how they view things. Ba'athist Arab socialists are not religious, and they believe on organizing the Arab nationality. Meanwhile, Shia Muslims are very religious, and they also believe that there should be no nationality, right? That it's about religion. All Muslims are equal. And so in Iraq, you have Ba'athist Arab socialism, a very anti-imperialist movement that's taken power. And in Iran, you have revolutionary Shia Islam that takes power. And these are both anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements that have taken power. And they both hate American imperialism. They are both opposed to Western capitalism, but they have a very different worldview. So what happens? The USA plays these two movements against each other. And what happened? The Iraq-Iran war that killed over 1 million people. The US government and the Israeli government were on both sides. They covertly gave weapons and aid to both sides during the war. And these are two revolutionary anti-imperialist movements that see things very differently from each other. One is for the Arab peoples and is secular. One is for all people and is very religious. And they play the two groups against each other. And 1 million people die. And the USA was on both sides of that conflict. We also know that after the Vietnam War ended, Vietnam was attacked by Cambodia, which was at the time was called Democratic Kampuchea. And it was run by a guy named Pol Pot. And Pol Pot called himself a communist, called himself a Maoist communist. And he was the leader of Democratic Kampuchea. He declared the year zero. And he had a weird interpretation of communism where he said you don't need industry. You don't need industrialization. You can build communism on a purely agrarian basis. And he murdered and he started exterminating the genuine communists in the Cambodian Communist Party. And then he attacked Vietnam. Now we know, it turns out, that Pol Pot was working for the U.S. imperialists. He was an agent of the U.S. imperialists, but he sounded like an ultra-revolutionary communist. He was actually working for the imperialists, and he attacked Vietnam, which was aligned with the Soviet Union. So what happened? China, which was then aligned with the United States and was supporting Pol Pot, invaded Vietnam in support of Pol Pot. And you had a situation where, there's a famous quote. There was a Vietnam veteran who said, they sent me to Vietnam and they told me that I was there to fight communists. But right now, America is getting friendly to the Chinese communists and arming the Cambodian communists to kill the Vietnamese communists because they're aligned with the Soviet communists. It didn't make any sense. It was a clusterfuck. And that's how the USA was able to win the Cold War. At the time that the Soviet Union fell, most of the communists in the world were not upset about what was happening. I mean, it was shocking. At the time the Soviet Union fell, you would think communists of the world would be horrified. The Soviet Union, the homeland of communism, has fallen. But in the United States, the slogan was, phony communism is dead. Long live real communism. That was what the RCP said. The Euro communists, the Communist Party of France, the Communist Party of Italy, the Communist Party of Spain had cut ties with the Soviet Union already, right? You had the Chinese communists who had cut ties with the Soviet Union and considered the Soviet Union to be social imperialists. You had a situation where it wasn't clear who was on what side. And that's the way the USA was able to win the Cold War, was by completely confusing and manipulating the anti-imperialist forces against each other, making it so you didn't know. If someone said, I'm a communist, that didn't tell you. At the beginning of the Cold War, in the 1950s and 60s, if someone said, I'm a communist, that meant they were on the Soviet side. In the 70s and 80s, if somebody said, I'm a communist, who knows what that meant? In Europe, that might mean that you were a member of the parliament and you hated the Soviet Union. In Africa, that might mean you were in a China-aligned group. It might mean you were aligned in a Soviet-aligned group. It might mean you were in an Albanian-aligned group. It might mean you were a Trotsky. I mean, it got to the point that they had created a clusterfuck and so much confusion among communists and among the forces that were aligned with the Soviet Union that at that point, the USA was able to maneuver and take power. And if you read about the civil war in Angola, where you had a civil war between UNITA, which was the Union for the Total Liberation of Angola, which was led by Jonas Savimbi, who was a literal cannibal. He ate people, right? Just a monstrous person. You read about Jonas Savimbi, but you read that Jonas Savimbi, who was funded by the U.S. imperialists in Angola, for a while, he was claiming to be a Maoist. He was calling himself a Maoist communist. And then in the 80s, he became a Jeffersonian Democrat and an evangelical Christian. He was an agent of the U.S. imperialists, but for a while he was a Maoist, and he was claiming the MPLA were sellouts. He was the name of his group is UNITA, the Union for the Total Liberation of Angola, right? The MPLA, right? They're the liberation movement of the people of Angola, but he's for the total liberation of Angola because the Soviet imperialists are who the MPLA really works for. But at the end of the day, he was just an agent of the imperialists, Jonas Savimbi, right? Right, but they created that confusion. And if you look at like Ethiopia and the Derg and the fighting that went on, they made it confusing. This is how they are able to win their conflicts, is by making it so people don't know who's on what side. And so then that raises the issue of counter gangs, right? And that it's very important for the imperialists to be able to manipulate extremists, because just like in this case, it gives them deniability. Right? They didn't attack Russia. Some Muslim guys who got recruited on the internet did. They didn't do it, right? I mean, it looks like very blatantly like the United States and NATO are responsible for this attack, right? Cancel me for saying it, call me a propagandist or whatever for saying it. It looks to me, all the signs are there. NATO did this. And that the United States government wants Russia to feel that NATO did this, right? That's why they issued the warning ahead of time. They wanted Russia to know this attack came from them. And the only reason it wasn't carried out by the U.S. military itself or the Ukrainian military itself is they wanted international deniability. That's what they wanted. They wanted deniability. They wanted to say to the world, we didn't do it. It was these Muslim guys. They got recruited on the internet. But the fact that they delivered the threat ahead of time, they specifically mentioned concert halls. I mean, it's very blatant. This was an attack by the United States against Russia. And it was a cowardly, shameful act. And it was aimed at civilians. This isn't a case of, they tried to bomb a power plant and they killed a civilian. This was a cowardly, murderous terrorist attack aimed at civilians. And I got to tell you folks that, the Pentagon, right? They bomb people, they kill people, but the intelligence apparatus of the United States, that is where you find the really evil motherfuckers. They make the Pentagon look like nice guys. Go read The Poisoner in Chief, the biography that Stephen Kinzer did of the CIA founder. Go and read The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which is the book on the CIA's MK Ultra mind control. The really evil motherfuckers are the intelligence agencies. The CIA are evil on a level that, this is where I'll go down this rabbit hole a little bit and then conclude my opening remarks. When we talk about good and evil, it gets a little bit confusing. Because one factor in good and evil is intent. All right? I'm not talking about law. I'm not talking about guilt or innocence. I'm just talking about good and evil. One factor in good and evil is intent. All right? Right? You can take the most murderous terrorist in the world. All right? And they'll say, I'm doing it for my religion. I'm doing it for my political cause. I'm fighting for my country, etc. And they'll mean it, right? And they might do the most murderous thing, but in their mind, they're doing something good. But you take a criminal, you take a con artist, right? Think about like a preacher who does fake faith healings, right? One of these con artists, right? He's pretending he can heal people when he doesn't have magical powers. He can't heal people. He's fake faith healing. He's lying to people, right? And it's like you look at that and you say, who's more moral, right? Maybe this terrorist killed more people, right? This IRA guy or this Wahhabi religious person, maybe they killed more people, but in their mind, they're doing the right thing. Whereas, this fake preacher who, is doing fake healings or is claiming he can talk to people's dead relatives when he can't, that guy is just a liar. Right? And a lot of people will look at that and they'll say that fake preacher, maybe he didn't kill anybody, he just scammed some people out of their money, but he's more evil because he knows he's doing wrong and doesn't care. Whereas the extremist thinks they're doing right. That's the difference between the CIA and the Pentagon. The Pentagon think they're doing right. Right? They think that they're doing the right thing. They think that they are fighting for Uncle Sam and apple pie and keeping us safe from terrorism. And that's what they believe. And that's why a lot of the Pentagon guys want to get along with Russia, right? Michael Flynn, right? General Michael Flynn. He wants to get along with Russia. Why? He wants to stop terrorist attacks. And he knows that Russia is really good at fighting Wahhabis and extremists and ISIS types. And so he's saying, doesn't make sense to have Russia be our enemy. We should be working with Russia, especially in Syria, where the groups that are trying to overthrow the Syrian government are Islamic extremist groups that are like tied to Al-Qaeda. General Michael Flynn, he says, I want to work with Russia because I want to fight terrorism. Michael Flynn is an honest man, right? He may be wrong on a lot, like he's wrong about Israel. He's wrong about the history of U.S. wars, but he believes what he's saying. He thinks he's right. Right? Tulsi Gabbard, right? Again, honest woman. I don't agree with her about Israel. And I used to like her a lot more, but she's really disappointed me. But she believes every word that she says, right? She's an honest person. That's the Pentagon. They're wrong, but they think they're right. The intelligence agencies, the CIA, are a completely different story. Victoria Nuland doesn't care about right and wrong. She has a vendetta against the Russians. Right? And when you have a group of people that say, okay, let's find somebody on the internet who we can manipulate into going into a stadium, a concert hall full of teenagers and children and open firing and killing over 100 of them. That is evil. That's evil. That's not somebody who thinks they're doing right. Right? And that the CIA and the American intelligence agencies are staffed by people who know they are doing wrong and do not care. It is staffed by and this is where it gets very weird, right? And if you read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that the author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman talks about when they tried to recruit him to American intelligence. And they specifically tried to find mental illness in him. They wanted to talk about his trauma and his pain. They wanted to talk about the anger that he might have. And they sat down with him and they were hoping to manipulate his mental illness. That's what he describes. I mean, I can find you the quote another time. This is just, I'm talking off the top of my head here. But the intelligence agencies, you read about MK Ultra. You read about Operation Midnight Climax. You read about British intelligence and what was done by William Sargent, who was the British psychologist who did all the sick mind control operations. These are people that know that they're hurting innocent people. These are people that know that are in a state of moral ambiguity where they don't really think the Soviet Union is necessarily evil. They just know that this gives them power, right? And that the intelligence agents, being an intelligence operative, gives them a taste of power, gives them access, right? That the intelligence agencies of the United States have a lot of power in Hollywood and they have a lot of power in the business world, and they're working with them. You're working with well-connected people who can really get you what you want. You're dealing with a level of evil that we can't quite comprehend. Go read The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Read about Carl Rogers, who went on. The CIA rewarded him by making him the top American psychologist and academic, and go and read about all the stuff he did for them, right? And you read about these experiments that they did on people and all of this. You're dealing with a level of evil here that, again, the Pentagon kill a lot of innocent people. The Pentagon do a lot of bad things, but when they do them, they think they're doing the right thing. The CIA is a different animal. The more you read about the history of the CIA and the more you observe stuff like this recent concert shooting, right? You know, there's no way that the intelligence operatives, be they in Ukraine or even, you know, more closer to home, who were involved in this attack, there's no way they were sitting there going, okay, we're on the side of right. We're going to kill a bunch of innocent children. We're going to find a guy on the internet who's a religious fanatic. We're going to manipulate him to get him to think he's doing it for his faith, but he's actually doing it for the Ukrainian. No, they knew they were doing wrong, right? You heard Victoria Nuland when she said there's been some nice surprises coming to Russia. Like, this is a level of evil. This is a level of gangsterism that we can't comprehend. Right? And this is really important. And this is a level of evil that is cultivated, right? You know, people naturally want to think they're doing the right thing. People want to believe they're doing right. People don't like to believe they're doing the wrong thing. People don't like to believe they're hurting innocent people. Right? People want to believe they're doing right. And to get people into the state of mind where they can do evil and laugh about it. Right? That is a level of evil, and that's the wing of the deep state. Whether the Ukrainian deep state, you know, or closer to home. The forces who carried out this recent terrorist attack in Russia are that this is a cultivated level of evil. A cultivated level of evil. People that have been, you know, taken to the point of being very spiteful and very, very dangerous. You know, I wrote a book about Kamala Harris, and my God, we have to do everything we can to make sure Kamala Harris does not become president, because Kamala Harris is this to a T. She is exactly this. Kamala Harris thinks she is a victim. She hates her father. Her father has denounced her. And she believes that little Kamala Harris was victimized somehow. And she probably was. I mean, we don't know why, exactly how, but Kamala has been hurt. And Kamala Harris believes that because she was hurt, she can hurt anybody else. And it's totally fine. And it was totally fine for her to cover up for the drug labs in California, turning over false positives, people going to prison because they were innocent. It was perfectly fine to argue that people had to be kept in jail because they needed their cheap labor, right? The prison industrial complex needed their cheap labor, so it was fine to keep them in jail. It's perfectly fine to try and block DNA evidence so that Kevin Cooper could get the death penalty, right? That is a kind of evil that is cultivated by the intelligence apparatus. Someone has to be very, very badly damaged and very, very, very much seeing themselves as a victim, very much mind-fucked. You have to be mind-fucked to be as evil as Kamala Harris and to be as evil as the kind of people that carried out this terrorist attack, right? Normal people who want to believe that they're on the side of right can do awful things. No question about it, right? There are all kinds of people throughout history who were normal, healthy people who thought they were doing right and did wrong. But with the intelligence apparatus of the United States and with counter gangs and psychological manipulations like what went on with this recent terrorist attack, you're seeing a level of evil that is far beyond that. You're seeing, I mean, think about it, right? I mean, when we realize that the people who carried out, who engineered this, the people who masterminded this, are probably not even Muslims. Okay? The people who engineered this attack are probably not Muslim. But they thought, okay, let's have somebody pretend to be a radical Muslim. Let's have them find like the perfect person on Telegram who we can manipulate and have them believe that they're doing this to fight for their faith. And okay, I'm just telling you, that's a level of evil. That's a level of the people who masterminded this horrendous terrorist attack. There's a level of evil there that says, I have a license to do whatever I want, to hurt other people. And again, I will just end this way. I'll end my opening remarks this way. We've got to get rid of gangster aesthetics, right? So many movies now, right? Look, don't blame it on the black community, right? It's not just the black community. And don't blame it on them, right? Many in the black community have said that gangster rap has had a negative impact, but that the kind of values you find in gangster rap are everywhere. Rap didn't start out that way. Rap started out as very socially conscious with Public Enemy and others, and the gangster stuff came as a result of big record companies, etc. And you know, there's nothing racist about this. We're not simply talking about the black community, but so many. I go and watch movies. I go to the movies with my wife. Hollywood is putting out gangster aesthetics, right? You mess with me and I'll fuck you up, right? Nobody can mess with me and I'll fuck you up, right? And I got some bling bling and I got money and I can fuck up anyone who gets in my way and I've got lots of money, right? That's the CIA mindset right now. They don't care about right and wrong, right? You know, they don't like Russia. Russia's getting in their way and they can mess them up. And they're on the side of the rich people. America has got money. And that's, you know, that gangster mindset that says, I'm in it for myself. I want to have lots of money. I want people to look at me and see that I'm tough and that I can hurt other people. You know, that mindset is a destructive mindset. It is a mindset that civilizations die. And that is not the mindset of Russia, right? I was just in Russia. I was in the same room as Russian President Vladimir Putin. He is not a gangster, right? I mean, he does not give off that vibe. And the people, the thousands of volunteers that I met in Russia, that's not how Russians feel. Russians are family oriented. They want to have children and raise them to have good values. They want to serve their community. They want to build. They want to construct. They want people in the country to be wealthier and happier. They don't have a gangster mindset. The gangster mindset is what's taking over the United States right now. We are becoming more and more of a culture with the gangster mindset, right? I'm going to get mine. Look, I've got money. The worship of wealth, the worship of hurting people who get in your way. This is not Russian at all, right? In Russia, you still got families that love each other. Still got people that love their community enough. I was at the World Youth Festival. They had 20,000 participants, but they also had 5,000 young, dedicated volunteers. These kids worked their ass off to put on the festival. And they had smiles on their faces the whole time. And every morning we're walking into the festival and they're out there giving us high fives. And, you know, you couldn't get American youth to act that way. They were all on the same team. They weren't canceling each other. No, they weren't, you know, getting triggered and having group therapy. They were like, we have got to put on this festival because America is trying to isolate Russia and we don't want to be isolated. And these kids were so loyal to their country and so cheerful and so happy and so dedicated. They did a great thing at the World Youth Festival. And you're going to see the great film that Peter Coffin puts. It's a different mindset, okay? And that I see even in revolutionary anti-imperialist circles, we get this gangster mindset. We got to get over that. No more gangster aesthetics, right? We need the old revolutionary, you know, if you want to be masculine, nothing wrong with masculine, right? Nothing wrong with that. We love masculinity. Be masculine like John Q. Go and see John Q, right? Maybe it's not the best movie ever made, but it's a movie about a father whose son can't get health care because of some insurance ripoff. So he goes and takes hostages, right? You know, he's a militant. He's a radical, but he's not a gangster. He's doing it out of love for his son. Go and watch The Grapes of Wrath, right? And look at Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath. Very masculine man, an ex-con who's been in prison, but go read about Joe Hill, right? Go read about Eugene Debs, right? You can be a masculine man. You can be a hero. You can be heroic. You can be strong, but you don't have to act like a gangster. You can have values. You can do it. You can have love for humanity. You can have maturity. You can have sophistication. You can have compassion. You can have patience. You can have kindness, right? We need to get away from the gangster aesthetic. So on that note, folks, we want to give all of our condolences to Russia. Absolutely. And we are just so horrified by our government and how it's acting. Names and locations, names and locations. There's a lot of people watching tonight. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Yeah, a lot of you here tonight. Names and locations, names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Pray for Russia. All right. We got seasoned noob in China, Rice from Adelaide, Australia, Zach from Minneapolis. We got Fannie Lou Hamer. We got Steve in Brisbane, Copenhagen, Montreal, Los Angeles, Tony in Tasmania, Washington State, Manchester, and in France, Alex in Brazil, Alberta, Canada, Ottawa, Quad Cities, Gavin. Shout out to Gavin. Geraldo from Brazil, Tom from Kentucky, Patrick in Maine, Ian Chester in England, Jamie in Boise, Idaho, Glasgow, Scotland, Isabel, right? Gangster rap started with the CIA. I believe it. I believe it. Chicago, Gabby in Chicago. Shout out to Gabby, great member of our community. Random Words, London, Canada. D in North Carolina. Ben Kavanaugh in Edinburgh, Scotland. Mark Jones in Utica, New York. Thomas in Texas, or Mill Hutch in Texas. Oregon. Stephanie from North Carolina. Welcome, welcome. Amarillo, Texas. And welcome, first-time viewers. Alistair in Ireland. Dave in Rochester, New York. Greetings from London. Vancouver, Canada. Bixie in San Mateo. Stephen N. in Ringgold, Georgia. Cheese Plant, Northern Hollywood, California. Gonzalo in Argentina. Kakalaki. Nate in Chicago. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the notifications bell. George from Detroit. Welcome, George. Jeff from Carson City, Nevada. Welcome, Jeff. Caitlin and CJ. Good to hear from you all. You're out in Richmond. Scary times. Amen. Brown, Charlotte, North Carolina. Randall in Lexington. Greetings from the Philippines. Saskatchewan. Very, very good. Very, very good. Ed in Louisville. Texas. Emperor Penguin, Alexis in Rochester, Bob Troy, New York. All right. Greetings from Poland, Alex Alien Symbiosis in Miami. All right. Well, hey, folks, before I start answering people's questions, we got 7 super chats. We got 1 Rumble rant. Nothing on the, we got on the Rockfin. We got 1 on the Rockfin we can respond to. But yeah, if you got a question, send me a super chat, send me a Rumble rant, or send me a Rockfin tip. That's the way we do things. But before we do that, I want to quickly remind you all, right, that we are having a national educational retreat workshop coming up in Vermont, April 26th through 29th. It's going to be really, really awesome. It's going to be a great in-person CPI, 4 days actually, educational workshop in Vermont. So it's going to be awesome. So please sign up and please attend. I hope to meet you there. It's going to be really, really great. You'll get to meet other people with anti-imperialist views, a lot of singing, a lot of good food, a lot of fun activities, a lot of classes. So if you'd like to join us, please come join our 4-day educational workshop. It'll be in a country area, rural area in Vermont. It's going to be very, very awesome. Just drop the link in the chat. I will drop it on the Rumble. Drop it on the Rumble, and I will drop it on the Rockfin. I hope you will join us. There's still plenty of room. Sometimes these things fill up, but there's still plenty of room. And we'd love to have you there. Good point. I will answer that. So if you got anything you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, it's about to start. By all means, send a super chat or a Rumble rant. Excuse me, spring allergies, or a Rockfin tip. That would be great. Make sure you sign up. We would love to have you join us at our spring retreat for the CPI. Love to have you there. So if you're able to come to Vermont and come to our spring retreat, we would love to have you. So on that note, folks, before we start answering questions, I just want to tell you, I just got to talk about this, right? We've been talking about bad news for the first half hour. Here's some good news, right? Tucker Carlson interviewed Chairman O'Malley of the Uhuru movement. The Uhuru case is the most important case in the United States right now. They are trying to prosecute leaders of the African People's Socialist Party, supposedly for being Russian agents. And it's an insane case. They're not accused of any crime other than spreading Russian propaganda. And if they're able to convict them, they're able to outlaw all kinds of anti-imperialist activism. But Tucker Carlson did an interview with Chairman O'Malley of the African People's Socialist Party, which I thought was a huge step forward, right? And I know it's because of the work of our organization that this interview happened, because Tara Reid, who is now in Russia, she's had to flee the country. Tara Reid, was a Senate staffer who was sexually assaulted by Joe Biden, and she's been calling out Joe Biden. She had to flee the country, but we had a conference, a CPI conference in Chicago a few years ago, 2 years ago to be exact. And at that conference, Tara Reid came and we gave her an award. And the Uhuru movement came because they had just been raided by the FBI. And Tara Reid had not heard about the Uhuru movement, but she met them and she became friends with them. And she got Tucker Carlson to do stories on their case for his TV show before it was canceled. And she got Tucker Carlson to interview, Chairman O'Malley. So CPI made this interview happen, right? By connecting Tara Reid with the Uhuru movement, by Tara Reid then connecting Tucker Carlson with the Uhuru movement. We made this interview happen. And I am honored. And I wanted to show you, this was the neatest moment in the interview. This was the best moment in the interview. Chairman O'Malley, an 80-year-old man who if convicted of being a Russian agent, could spend 15 years in prison. And he's a far left communist. And he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, who's a lifelong conservative. But they had a beautiful moment together. And this is the clip I'm going to show you.
But I'm confused. So you're describing basically what the Black Lives Matter people said 4 years ago. Some of them got legit rich out of it. You don't seem like you've gotten rich. And they got all this money from Apple, the biggest companies in the world. And of course, the media cheerled them. How did you miss out on that?
Well, because the thing is, like, to say Black Lives Matter is such an empty slogan. It's a whine rather than a demand. It's empty. I mean, Joe Biden says Black Lives Matter. I mean, you got the whole Democratic Party, Congress and whatever, get out on one knee with kente cloth from Ghana over their shoulder saying Black Lives Matter. Because it doesn't mean anything. It's a non-statement. But what we say is Black people have to have power. So we want power over our own life. That's the question. And that's the basis for the difference in how they would treat Black Lives Matter and how they would treat us. And you're right. The Black Lives Matter slogan is almost a Zuckerberg manufactured slogan. Certainly if it's not manufactured by Zuckerberg, it's certainly promoted by Zuckerberg and all the white people who love us.
Yeah, it was a great interview. And if you want to learn more about the case, go to handsoffuhuru.org. Everyone who believes in freedom of speech and civil liberties should be supporting the Uhuru movement right now. The fact that Tucker Carlson is standing up for them, that tells you a lot. It would take a lot for Tucker Carlson to stand up and support a group of Black communists, right? But he's doing it because he can see how dangerous the prosecution of them is. So go and check out handsoffuhuru.org, learn about the case. It is one of the most important cases. And we have, and shout out to members of CPI, John McCarthy in particular, who have really worked hard, to carry out CPI. We are trying to do everything we can to raise awareness about the Uhuru case. And we have really focused on that. We actually included a speech that was given at a Uhuru event in our booklet that we were giving out at the World Youth Festival in Russia. We have this booklet, Russia is Not Our Enemy. And we actually included a speech by one of our members, John McCarthy, to a Uhuru gathering that he gave, laying out the case and why we are so dedicated to supporting Uhuru. You can read about that. It's, stand up against imperialism, a global perspective. That's John McCarthy. It's a speech he gave at a Uhuru convention. We at CPI, look, we don't agree with the African People's Socialist Party. We don't agree with their view. We are believers in creating, a socialist United States. We're patriotic. We wave the American flag. But the Uhuru movement, if they can jail them, they can jail any of us, right? They're trying to make it illegal to be anti-imperialist. And if anyone is a sincere anti-imperialist, they should be doing everything they can to support Uhuru right now. John McCarthy is a great guy. He's a beloved member of our group. CPI, we have a lot of great people in CPI. Every time we have our Saturday Zoom call, it's like a big up for me to see the group of people we brought together. We just had our Saturday Zoom call today. We have a weekly Zoom call that's open to any CPI members. Then we have different committees that meet and manage different things. We have local meetups. I know they're having a local meetup in Chicago tomorrow. Shout out to our Chicago members. They're having a Pacific Northwest meetup later this month. And, and we're then having our national education weekend, our 4-day workshop at the end of April. We have a really good group of people who are really dedicated, and we're not building a social media brand, right? I don't care. I'm glad that all of you are watching right now, but I am not interested in winning social media. Social media is rigged, and I am dedicated to building a community of people to build real anti-imperialist operations and work in the United States. That's what I am dedicated to. And CPI are a group of people who want to do it with us. And we do great stuff. Look, we put out and we circulated a great book supporting the Houthis, right? Who are the Houthis? What are they fighting for? This book has gotten out there, right? We just sent a delegation to Russia. We were invited to speak with the Russian president. 2 CPI members, myself and Noah, got up and got to talk to the president of the Russian Federation. We have done a lot, right? We've put on conferences. We've published books. We've had protests. We do a lot, right? And, I'm really proud of our organization and all that we've accomplished. So on that note, I am going to start answering people's questions. So I'm going to do the Rumble rants first. I think there have been 2 of them. So the first Rumble rant is Zacharoni Pizza. Do you have any thoughts on Yuri Bezmenov, the 1980s Soviet defector who resettled in Canada and purported to have revealed the mechanics of the KGB operation to ideologically subvert the U.S. population? Well, I've seen the clips of the guy, and from what I understand, that guy, from what I've seen, that's right-wing podium pounding. Okay. They're trying to erode our morals from within, the right-wing narrative of the Cold War is the Soviet Union was defeated by the arms race. It was not. It was defeated by internal subversion by the United States, where the United States ideologically penetrated it. Gorbachev really believed that the Soviet Union would be allowed to become like Norway or Sweden, a social democratic welfare state. And they didn't understand that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the USA was going to go in there and loot the place. And that there was a whole effort by the synthetic left, the left, the so-called left, to go in and confuse the Soviet leaders. And, you read about, the new left, et cetera, the color revolution apparatus, whole layers of the Soviet Communist Party were manipulated into believing that the Democrats, it was only Reagan who didn't like them, but the Democrats were their friends, et cetera. So that guy, he said stuff that right-wing conservatives wanted to hear. The liberalism is eroding America from within. It's all a Soviet conspiracy. And that's not the case. And that what I often hear from conservatives now is they conflate the synthetic left that was funded by the CIA with Soviet communism. And they're not the same thing, right? Cultural Marxism, the Frankfurt School and all that was funded by American intelligence as a way to subvert genuine communism. The Soviet Union, they liked socialist realist art. And American intelligence liked abstract art and modern art, right? The Soviet Union liked classical music. American intelligence liked rock and roll music, right? The Soviet Union, I'm embracing this. I'm just telling you that, for a lot of the Soviet Union's existence, they thought homosexuality was bourgeois decadence. It was a disease from capitalism. If you went to the Soviet Union, and you said, oh, do you have gay people here? They'd say, no, we don't have them here. That's a disease from capitalism. We don't have any of that. Whereas the synthetic left, they were all about LGBT rights. Now, I believe people should be able to be who they are. I'm not against that. But I'm just very frustrated. It frustrates me. I know you got to learn, right? These things, it takes time. But the obnoxious cancel culture, pink-haired synthetic left that is against economic growth, and the Soviet Union and China and Cuba and North Korea are not the same thing. They're just not, right? And I'm just telling, I was just at a world festival of communists, right? At the World Festival of Youth. I was at that festival and I was talking to communists from all over the world. That's not the same thing, right? And I see this in conservative circles over and over and over again. They try to say that, the cancel culture is just like China. And it's like, the biggest difference is this. The synthetic left, the fake left, they are against economic growth. They think growth is bad. But what did all the communist governments do as soon as they took power? They nationalized the means of production and they mobilized the population to build, to construct with 5-year plans. And we have that quote from Margaret Thatcher where she says, socialism doesn't work because eventually you run out of other people's money. Well, if all Stalin had done was redistribute other people's money, the Soviet Union would still be an agrarian, impoverished society. He mobilized the population to build the world's biggest power plants, the world's biggest steel mills, to invent space travel. If all the Chinese Communist Party had done was redistribute other people's money, China would still be one of the poorest countries in the world. Now it's a global superpower, right? If all Fidel Castro had ever done was redistribute other people's money, Cuba would still be an impoverished island. Now, instead, it has the highest life expectancy in Latin America. It's got, a huge, despite the U.S. blockade and everything, they've done a lot to industrialize, electrify, wipe out illiteracy. Socialism is not the redistribution of wealth. The redistribution of wealth happens in every society. Socialism is a centrally planned economy so that the irrationality of capitalism can be overcome. Capitalism is the only system that's ever existed where people are hungry because there is too much food, where people are homeless because there are too many houses, where abundance creates poverty. People are poor because wealth exists. That's not rational, right? Self-driving cars should be a great thing. In a rational society, self-driving cars would be a great thing. But in our capitalist system, self-driving cars would mean mass unemployment. What sense does that make? Why should labor-saving technology result in poverty? Because of capitalism. Capitalism has this built-in problem called overproduction. Capitalism has this built-in problem called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Capitalism is a system where abundance and technological advancement leads to poverty and instability in the economy. And you can overcome that by central planning. And then people say, well, China is capitalist. Well, China has much higher state ownership rate than Venezuela does. They have 5-year economic plans. Even private companies in China are not free to do what they want. They're basically told what to do by the government. China has a market economy that is heavily controlled to make sure that growth is unlimited and that growth doesn't stop, right? And the communist world is moving to be more like China in terms of its economy. Vietnam with their socialist-oriented market economy, Nicaragua with their socialist micro-entrepreneurship programs, etc. The communist world is moving toward that model of a centrally planned and state-controlled system that utilizes market forces, right? So saying that, that China's success since the 1970s proves that capitalism is the best system, that would be like saying, it was cold in my room last night and I turned on the heat and it got better. So therefore, I should light my bedroom on fire because that proves that heat is always the answer. China adjusted their socialist system. They adjusted it to have more market mechanisms, which was the right thing to do, in my view. That doesn't mean that markets are always the answer, right? And that just means that, yes, you do need markets for things that make life fun, like restaurants, like hotels, like children's toys. Yes, you need market mechanisms for those things, but profits should not be in command. And that's the difference between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism is profits in command. Socialism is when the economy is rationally organized to operate in the benefit of all society. Socialism is economic planning. Capitalism is the chaos of the market. So there we go. All right. And I got another Rumble rant on here. What to make of the contrast of this gangster culture with woke culture at the same time? I think there's a big overlap. I guess the main difference between gangster culture and woke culture, gangster culture is very much about, it worships a kind of petty strength, right? Gangster culture worships wealth, and gangster culture worships masculinity and toughness, being able to fuck up somebody who gets in your way. Whereas woke culture it worships weakness and it thinks wealth is bad. But I would argue that both of them are very shallow, right? Woke culture is about vengeance. It's about resentment. It's about feeling sorry for yourself. It's about being triggered. It's about kind of getting into a cycle of negative emotions, self-pity, victim complex, etc. Whereas gangster culture it's a very defensive, narcissistic thing, right? It's like you think of like wokeism is like a depressed person who's kind of stuck in a cycle of self-pity, and their internalized depression becomes externalized as rage at others, right? That's what wokeism is. Whereas gangster culture is narcissism, right? A narcissist is somebody who has a very, very low ego. And we say narcissists love themselves too much. No, they don't. Right? A narcissist, they are full of themselves, and they can't stand any criticism, and they're constantly, demanding that they get validation because they actually have very weak self-esteem, right? And that's what gangster culture is, right? Nobody messes with me. I'm going to mess them up. I'm going to show them that I'm tough, right? Look how much money I have. Look at all my bling bling, how rich I am. Gangster culture is a very shallow person that needs the validation. They need to constantly remind themselves how tough they are. They need to constantly remind themselves how rich they are, how wealthy they are, because they're insecure. And it's a little bit different than woke culture, right? Woke culture is depression and self-pity and a cycle of negative emotions. Gangster culture is narcissism. It's a fragile ego and narcissism. So that's the difference. Hope that helps, Jamie. That was Jamie Turner who asked that one. And on Rockfin, Pachico Rane says, thank you, Caleb. And Hemp Car says, keep up this essential work. Hey, I'm doing the best I can, folks. Doing the best I can. Forgive my spring allergies. I've got some spring allergies here. But doing the best I can. So, all right. So now we're going to start doing the super chats that have come in on here. And if anyone has any more questions for me before we end this, just send a super chat. We're about to hit the 2-hour mark, but that's okay. We'll answer the super chats. First one, are you familiar with Atlantis Network? It's a libertarian think tank that works in many countries and funds people like Javier Milei and Yunomi Park. I am not familiar with it, but that Javier Milei is an idiot, right? And what annoys me about Javier Milei is, I know a lot of libertarians are smarter than he is, right? I know a lot of libertarians that are pro-BRICS. I know a lot of libertarians that love Russia and China. But that Javier Milei, he pulled Argentina out of the BRICS because, they're communists. He wants the US dollar. Javier Milei is not anti-imperialist. He's pro-imperialist, and he's pro-Israel. He's a Zionist, right? He's not just pro-Israel. He's like trying to convert to Judaism because he's so pro-Israel, right? So, and a lot of libertarians I know are anti-Israel. So, there's a lot of libertarians that aren't as dumb as Javier Milei. Right. But Javier Milei, that guy is an idiot. And I debunked his speech at the World Economic Forum. I did a great video debunking that. You can watch that. Someone maybe can drop the link in the chat. It's one of my better videos where I just debunked his whole speech. But all these people have it in their head that Javier Milei is fighting the neoliberal order. He's fighting. He's not. Javier Milei is like the best foot soldier they ever had. He pulled out of the BRICS. He's kissing Israel's ass. Show me anything that Javier Milei that has done that is against the World Economic Forum, that is against the New World Order. I can't think of anything he's done. He calls himself a libertarian, and he deregulates the economy so big corporations can make more profits. That's all. I don't see anything Javier Milei has done that is anti-imperialist in any way, that is against the global elite in any way. He espouses a bunch of stupid Cold War anti-communist cliches, right? I mean, so there you go. Yeonmi Park, I think, is hilarious because, first of all, if anyone defects from North Korea and goes to South Korea has the national security law. So if they say anything positive about North Korea, they go to jail, right? So, South Korean people in South Korea or who defected to South Korea are not trustworthy on anything they say about North Korea because they're saying it under duress. They could be arrested under the national security law. That said, Yeonmi Park is hilarious because she takes it to a whole nother level when she says the trains don't work. They don't have electricity in North Korea for the trains. The people just push them. You know how heavy trains are? How strong the North Koreans must be if every time a train moves in North Korea, it's because the people are moving it, right? And then she says that college campuses are worse than North Korea. I saw her say that on Fox News. So, maybe she doesn't like North Korea, but she said that American college campuses are worse. And she said that. So, don't criticize colleges in North Korea because apparently American capitalism produces way worse colleges, according to Yeonmi Park. So there you go. I find her to just kind of be hilarious. All right. Has CPI considered having branches in other countries? Maybe some listeners would consider being paid members, traveling to the USA for conferences to learn about organizing their own countries in the same manner. Here's the thing. There's a legal question if you're a nonprofit with having people that are members outside of the country. I know there's people in Australia that love our work, that are supporters. I know there's people in the British Isles, in Britain, UK, that are supporters of our work, love our work. I would love to help, people in other countries get ideas about how to build their own organization. I would love to, support their efforts. But as far as CPI as an organization in the United States, we are a US-based organization, but we'd love to have you. Hey, Jane, if you want to come to the United States, come to one of our conferences, talk to CPI members about how you could possibly do something out in New Zealand. Good for you. I think that'd be a great thing for you to do. I'm all about that. But we are a US-based group, though. Okay. Thank you, Veeplin. Thank you for that. Very, very good. You are right, Caleb. They're trying to scare Russian people. I don't think this was ISIS either. I think whoever did it is trying to incite anti-Muslim sentiments. And I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right, Gala. This was the United States. This came from the United States. It looks like that from every angle, with the Ukrainian government that is basically controlled by the United States and the EU, and then with the threat from the USA. That's what happened here. It's really horrifying. And thank you, Gala. Pray for Russia. Context of the 1991 CPUSA split. What was happening? Okay, so the Communist Party USA, they are the Soviet-aligned party in the United States. When the fall of the Soviet Union was happening, there was not discussion of it going on in the Communist Party. And many members of the Communist Party were very frustrated by that. They felt like, the whole time that Gorbachev was in power, Gus Hall just said everything's great. Everything's going well. Everything's fine. Clearly, things were not fine beneath the surface. There was a problem. When Gorbachev was arrested, Gus Hall did come out and support the arrest of Gorbachev and say that Gorbachev was trying to dismantle the Soviet Union, but it was pretty late in the game. There were problems with Gorbachev. There were problems in the Soviet Union. Gus Hall didn't talk about it. A lot of members of the Communist Party felt that there had not been proper discussion in the party about it, about what was happening in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was clearly changing, and the Communist Party was not having conversations about it. But also, there was, globally, in the global communist movement, you had Euro-communism. You had a number of people in the global communist movement who didn't believe in communism anymore. Right. And the communist parties of the world had a lot of just straight up social democrats in them. The French Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, and the Spanish Communist Party cut ties with the Soviet Union in 1978. And all across the Western world, you had a lot of people that were in communist parties that didn't support the Soviet Union. They wanted better diplomatic relations with the USSR. They wanted more, reforms, but they also were critical. And there was a whole layer of people. And Angela Davis was one of those people. She was an academic, and she, she was very much aligning herself with Gorbachev, aligning herself with the reformist wing that eventually dismantled the USSR. And there were a lot of college professors and other type people who were kind of where she was at, where they wanted more peace with the Soviet Union, and they wanted maybe more social democratic reforms in the West, but they weren't communists really. You had a layer of people in the Communist Party USA that were communists, but you have to keep in mind that the Communist Party, for decades at that point, their main work had been supporting the Democrats. They had been campaigning for the Democrats. That was their main focus. And because of that, even the more dedicated and hardcore people, I mean, they had still been campaigning for the Democrats for years. And that's all they knew. And they were used to kind of pandering to liberals and used to kind of concealing their communist views to appease liberals. And so because of that, when the fall of the Soviet Union happened, there was a layer of people in the Communist Party that said, well, this proves that Marxism-Leninism is out of date. This proves we should really be democratic socialists and social democrats. We shouldn't be Marxist-Leninists anymore. And then there were also people who were just angry with Gus Hall. They felt Gus Hall had lied to them. They felt that the Communist Party had not facilitated proper discussion of why the fall of the Soviet Union had happened. And because of that, they quit en masse. Right. I don't know what more to say about it. I did a great podcast with Peter Coffin, that went into a great detail about this. And it was really one of the most thorough discussions I've ever had on the topic. It was a podcast with Peter Coffin on the role of CPUSA, and the fall of the USSR, why the fall of the USSR happened, and the negative role played by the Communist Party during those years. I'll drop the link in the chat. I really went into great detail about how the Communist Party was operating in those years, the problems, etc. And here, there's the link. It's a podcast with Peter on CPUSA and the fall of the Soviet Union. This is one of the best discussions on this topic I think I've ever had. We got into great detail, and I'm dropping it in the Rumble. I'm dropping it on the Rockfin. If you really want to learn, about this in great depth, about the 1991 split in the Communist Party and what happened, there were a layer of people who, at the time the Soviet Union fell, there were a couple different interpretations, but the interpretation that Gus Hall had, and the interpretation that was the view of the dedicated communists in the Communist Party, was that the Soviet Union had abandoned its principles, and that there was a layer of the Soviet Communist Party, people grouped around Gorbachev and others, who didn't believe in communism anymore, who'd betrayed the Soviet Union. That was their perspective. However, Angela Davis and a lot of Communist Party members had the opposite perspective. They said the fall of the Soviet Union meant that there was something inherently wrong with Marxism-Leninism, meant that really you should just have social democracy, that Gorbachev had said he wanted to make the USSR into a social democratic country. He believed in universal human values, not class struggle, etc. And that it was basically, how do you interpret the fall of the Soviet Union? Gus Hall interpreted it as a betrayal of Marxism-Leninism, and Angela Davis interpreted it as the result of a flaw in Marxism-Leninism. And that was really the difference that existed. So committees of correspondence was formed. The Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism is the group that was formed. And after Gus Hall died, they let all of the people who quit rejoin. There was like a blanket amnesty for all the people that had quit in 1991. And many of the leaders of the Communist Party today are actually people who quit in the early 90s, people that quit back then. And Angela Davis, they have big events to support. I don't think she's rejoined, but the CPUSA, the people that run it now, a lot of them quit in 1991 and were allowed to rejoin when Sam Webb became the leader after Gus Hall died. But it's important to note that even in the 80s, even in the 70s and 80s, before the fall of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party really had gotten into the habit of devoting so much of its time to just campaigning for the Democrats, not preaching socialism, just campaigning for the Democrats, that because of that, the Communist Party, was not really prepared ideologically for the fight. There's a lot there. So I would encourage you, go and watch the podcast on this I did with Peter Coffin. I go into great detail about the fall of the Soviet Union and the negative role played by the Communist Party in those years, how the Communist Party was basically used to funnel disinformation into the Soviet Union, etc. So there we go. That's an answer to that question. All right. Okay. Stop terrorism, pray for Russia. Absolutely. I'm utterly horrified by this event. So there we go. They are making a documentary in Argentina to be aired tomorrow on the anniversary of the Black dictatorship that claims that during that there was a war against communist terrorists and that the war was made. The Pinochet worship. I don't get that. Pinochet, you want to know something that drives me crazy? Right? Pinochet's economic policies were a disaster for Chile, right? When he came into power and he cut the food subsidies, and Pinochet's economic policies in Chile were utterly, utterly horrendous. But libertarians have it in their mind that, they were amazingly successful. And then they talk about the Chilean economic miracle that happened in the 80s, right? Pinochet took power in 1973 in Chile. And the economic expansion that happened in Chile happened in like 1982. There's about a 9-year gap there. And in the early 80s, Chile started renationalizing things and reasserting state control over its economy. So the idea that that's because of libertarian economics is just an utter delusion, right? Pinochet started using the military to try and stabilize the economy in the early 80s. So yeah, Milton Friedman's economic policies did not create miracles. And that you're talking about the military dictatorship in Argentina, which didn't come to power until the 80s. But, I sympathize with you. I don't know enough to really give a thorough comment on that battle Cossack, but I'm with you. All right. Tupac was a Baltimore Young Communist League member. That is true. Well, and Tupac is related to Asada Shakur, right? That's a relative of his who was in Cuba, was a Black Liberation Army member who fled to Cuba. She broke out of prison and fled to Cuba after she was arrested. She's still in Cuba, right? And that, Tupac had revolutionary family connections. His family were a family of activists and radicals. And that's part of why his rap music was very much a threat to the status quo. It had a different character to it than a lot of the music that's promoted nowadays. So there you go. What's going to happen at the next eclipse? Well, I imagine the moon will go between the sun and the earth. That's generally what happens in eclipses. That's my prediction. I predict that at the next eclipse, the moon will pass between the earth and the sun. But you're asking me what will happen. I'm not an astrologer. I don't make astrological predictions. So there we go. We should listen to detransitioners and the consequences of transitioning children at a younger age. Hey, my position generally is that when it comes to the trans thing, I generally when it comes to the trans thing, I let other people speak. That's my policy. Is that I don't know enough about it and I just don't want to talk about it. But what you're pointing to, Gabby, I've seen the same stuff that you've seen, and it's honestly very, very disturbing. It's very, very disturbing, and it's horrifying. Why is that off limits to discuss, right? And again, with that issue, there's a lot of things that people raise about women's sports, about children being put on puberty blockers and the impact that are worth discussing. And I don't think that people should be canceled or, banned from internet spaces just for bringing it up. That said, I don't really want to make that the issue of conversation. I want to talk about economics and class struggle and let people. I want people that might be dealing with something in their life and have their issue or whatever. I want them to feel welcome. But I don't think that these topics should be off limits in our general circles. I think people have the right to raise these issues. And I've seen some very disturbing things, Gabby, I've seen that. But at the same time, I don't know enough about it, and I'm not going to make that the focus of our community. But I know that people have their concerns and they have the right to have their concerns. And I don't know enough about it to comment really, but I've seen the same stuff you've seen. You've probably seen way more than I have, Gabby, but what I've seen certainly disturbs me. So there you go. All right. Martine Harrison says Italian right-wing thought and anti-growth. Well, Julius Evola, in his book, Man Among Ruins, he refers to what he calls the demonic nature of the economy. And it's growth, right? It's that you want constant growth and you want constant expansion. And he attacks economic growth in his book. And I read it, Man Among Ruins, right? The post-war thoughts of Italian fascist Julius Evola talks about growth being bad. And it's the whole section of his book called The Demonic Nature of the Economy. And he glorifies feudalism in Asia, because he says in feudal societies in Asia, people didn't want more than they already had. And he quotes a story which he says may not be true. It's just like a story. And I've heard this story other places too. I don't know if it's true or not. Right? It sounds like a noble savage's, white people story, but could be true. I don't know. But the story is supposedly there was a European capitalist who set up a factory in some Asian country. And he wanted to motivate the people to work harder. So he doubled everyone's pay. And after he doubled everyone's pay, all the workers showed up and they said, well, we're only available to work half the time now. And he didn't understand why they would do that. And the idea was they didn't want more than they already had. And so if they were getting paid twice as much, that meant they could work half as much and have more time with their family and stuff like that. And I don't know if that's true. And it sounds dumb. I don't know, but I've heard that story told many times by like hippie kind of people. It's like, oh, see, and we live to have more, but they had enough, and so they could, and it's like, and Julius Evola quotes that to be like, oh, these Asian societies are more pure. Julius Evola, who was an ideologue of Italian fascism, was a great admirer of Tibetan feudalism, of the caste system in India, because he saw those as stable societies where everyone was born into their place, born into their caste, born into their position, and didn't want more, right? And that was a big part of fascist thinking, right? Is that fascists are striving to get rid of the contradictions of capitalism and try to kind of mimic feudalism, to go back to the order that existed in feudal society, kind of roll back the instability that comes with modern capitalism by moving backward, not moving forward, right? They don't want to move toward a centrally planned economy. Instead, they want to move backwards toward a more rigid and authoritarian and controlled capitalism. That seems to be what a lot of fascists want. But let me emphasize this, right? If you want to learn about fascism, right, first of all, right, read R. Palm Dutt. Do I have that book here? Right? Read Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt. Or you can read Where is America Going? I talk about it a lot in my book, Where is America Going? Fascism is not about what you believe. It's about what you do. All right? Let me emphasize that. Fascism is not about what you believe. It's about what you do. Right? And fascists talk all kinds of different ways, but it's about what they do. Fascism is an attempt to stabilize capitalism and stabilize capitalism in a crisis with forced degrowth. It is about driving down living standards, creating a slave labor underclass, reducing consumption. It is degrowth. The essence of fascism is degrowth in order to stave off an economic crisis. Fascism is degrowth. Degrowth is fascism. The essence of fascism is economic degrowth. And that you can justify it with whatever language you want. Racism, nationalism, Italian futurist aesthetics, whatever you want. But that's what it is. Fascism is degrowth. It is an attempt to save capitalism from a prolonged economic crisis of overproduction as degrowth. No, fascism does not have an ideology. The Nazis sounded completely different than the Italian fascists. Completely different, right? The Italian fascists were futurists, and the Nazis were all about, Valhalla and Odin and paganism. No, they do not. There is not an ideology there, right? This is the standard thing on the left, right? Fascism is an ideology. Oh, it's when people say right-wing things. There were all kinds of people in German history who said anti-Semitic things who weren't fascists. There are all kinds of people in German history who said right-wing nationalist things who weren't fascists. There are all kinds of people that say right-wing authoritarian things that aren't fascist. What made fascism unique was that it was a liberal, open society collapsing into illiberalism and trying to save capitalism with degrowth, right? And that this is something that liberals cling to. No. Fascism is when people say racist shit. People have said racist shit for a long time. Fascism is when people wear military uniforms. No, it's not. Fascism is an aesthetic. No, it's not. Right? No, it's not. Right? Fascism is not an aesthetic. It's not an ideology. Fascism is capitalism in decay. It is when capitalism reaches a prolonged crisis of overproduction, the liberal open society collapses into illiberalism, and the state tries to forcibly degrow, creating a slave labor underclass, heavily suppressing people within the ruling class. And you can just keep saying that. You can keep saying that, but it doesn't make it true, right? Fascism is the collapse of the Western liberal open society into illiberalism and an attempt to stabilize capitalism with degrowth. Just keep saying other things, right? But this is the essence of truth. All over the world, fascism is implemented in many different ways, with many different ideologies and many beliefs. And many of the beliefs that people consider to be fascist beliefs, are taken on by others, are taken on by other tendencies, right? Conservatism, nationalism, right? Looking to the past. I mean, the Nazis were big environmentalists. Did you know that? They were always talking about preserving the environment. So, you say fascism is an ideology. Is environmentalism part of that ideology? That's a big part of Nazism. What about homosexuality? Before the Nazis took power, they were obsessed with homosexuality. The leader of the Nazi SS, Ernst Rem, was an openly gay man, and that they emphasized that they were for gay rights. So is gay rights fascist? Now, after the Nazis took power, they killed gay people and put them in camps. But, when the Nazis were building their street fighting movement, they were for gay rights. Is that part of the Nazi ideology, part of this fascist ideology? Fascism isn't about what you do, or isn't about what you say. It's about what you do, right? Right? You can call yourself whatever you want. It's about what you do, right? And that in some cases, fascists do sound like communists. Right? They talk about a revolution. They build a mass movement. But what they do is the opposite of what communists do. Communists mobilize society to seize control of the means of production. They build a planned economy that grows and expands living standards. Fascism is about collapsing a liberal society into authoritarianism and reducing consumption. Fascism is degrowth. All righty. All right. Very good. U.S. election is near, and that terror attack in Moscow, strange timing. Well, the U.S. election isn't until November. We got some time, right? The conventions are in July and August, and then we've got the election in November. The Russian election just happened recently, but the U.S. election isn't until November. So, but yes, I would argue that, look, the USA lost in Ukraine. Right. And Joe Biden is going to probably start de-escalating things because he doesn't want to take this to the polls with him in November, because the American people don't agree with him. They don't want millions of dollars spent on Ukraine while America's falling apart. They just don't want that. And so, I mean, it looks to me like the American government is going to start de-escalating. The fact that Victoria Nuland resigned, but this horrendous terrorist attack, I don't know what the result of this is going to be. It's a cowardly, evil thing the American government did. All right. It's cowardly and evil. All right, folks. Well, that seems to be, oh, wait, is there another? Nope. That seems to be all of the super chats. I do appreciate everyone who's here. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you hit the notifications bell. Make sure you hit the like button. Glad you all are here. I'm going to keep doing these streams like I always do. Thank you all for being here. And I'm going to put on the closing music.
New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.